I'm actually going to start with a story about a librarian, conveniently enough. So when I was about 10 years old, I was a voracious reader, and I got very obsessed for a while with the Chronicles of Narnia. So I went to a librarian and I said, I just finished reading these books. What should I read next? And she gave me Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising series, which I'm still grateful for. These are very good books. And this was in the early 90s. It was before the internet. It was before, if you like, you might like, if this sort of thing seems familiar. Librarians, the original recommender systems. So this was great. She knew a lot about books. She knew a little bit about me because she'd been giving me books for a while, and so she knew exactly how to create a recommendation just for me. And now we can do this at scale. So Goodreads does this for me as well, as does Amazon, though sometimes they lack a little bit of context. So I haven't actually told Goodreads every book that I've read in my entire life. So it doesn't know, for example, that obviously I've already read Robert Jordan and Game of Thrones. And Amazon knows a lot because I buy books from there sometimes, but they don't know that sometimes I don't buy all of my books from them. So I already have a copy of Station 11, and it's wonderful, and you should read it. But sometimes they're lacking some context. So recommender systems, these kind of algorithms aren't perfect. And this isn't very harmful, no harm done. For example, telling me I should read Game of Thrones again. We see other kinds of recommender systems too. This is not actually what Facebook recommended to me. I found this on the internet. But Facebook, for example, says, you may know these people. Maybe these should be your friends. But then this kind of thing happens. Because algorithms aren't perfect and they lack context a lot of times, right? So Facebook doesn't always know, for example, who your ex was because you're not friends with them on Facebook for very good reasons. Sometimes misinformation happens because things are just hard, though. Like, it's not that these algorithms are malicious, they're not trying to recommend that you should friend your ex-boyfriend on Facebook, but some things are just hard to judge. Some things are hard for humans to judge in particular. Sometimes it's not their fault, though. We're going to talk about fair use in a minute, and I really don't fault anyone who can't make perfect judgments about fair use. And sometimes things are really hard for algorithms to judge, too. Both of these things make misjudgments. They're a little bit different, and this is the kind of thing that we're going to be talking about. I'm going to start with some human misjudgments. We're going to talk about copyright. It happens to be my area of expertise. I went to law school, and I still can't make perfect judgments about copyright. But as far as the law goes, it's pretty much the only thing that I can make a reasonable judgment about at this point. And when I told people for a long time that I study the internet and copyright, they would say, oh, so like piracy. And I would say, no, piracy is boring. Because you know the rules about piracy, right? Like, you might download Game of Thrones, but you know it's wrong. Like, there's no legal question about whether that's okay. It's pretty clear cut. Like, if you're making misjudgments, it's a moral misjudgment. It's not like, oh, I thought that this was totally fine. I'm more interested in things that are a little more complicated. For example, things like fair use, which of course is, I assume, I don't have to explain this to most people in the room, but fair use handles the exceptions to copyright law. And one of the reasons that fair use is a bit tricky is because when the laws were written, we were dealing with things like printing presses and Xerox machines. But now we have much more complicated things that we might be wondering, what's an exception to copyright and how can I reuse things? Like remix videos and parodies and basically everything that's on Facebook. Copyrighted content is just everywhere. That my little quip that I use is, it used to be that only lawyers and big corporations and professional content creators cared about copyright, but now it's relevant to everyone with an internet connection and a share button. And so we have to deal with fair use, which is more complicated, right? If you're wondering about this image, I will come back to it later. But suffice it to say, it's a bit subjective, it's a bit fuzzy, it's not bad, and it serves a very good purpose, but it is difficult to make judgments about. And yet it's super important, because without these kinds of exceptions to copyright law, we wouldn't have VCRs, or Betamax, as this picture is about. I sometimes tell my students that the Supreme Court case about Betamax is one of the cases where if it had gone a little bit differently, would have changed the entire course of our technological development. So that was a really important one. We also need remix videos. Those are extremely important. So I can tell someone, like, wow, the special edition releases of Star Wars were pretty bad. I hope that they don't mess up the new Star Wars movies by doing similar things. Or you can recut the trailer and like throw Anakin Skywalker into the middle of it for no reason. And you can make that point much better, right? And then of course there's things like Google Books, fair use. Google image search, also there was a court case that almost was not fair use. And both the Google image search actually and the Betamax case were super close. So you can see why it's hard to make judgments. It's not like there are clear guidelines. And so sometimes it ends up being a little bit like a minefield. How do you know what to do? In fact, when I made this slide, I did a Google image search for fair use flowchart. Don't try to use any of these, I would assume. And when I started grad school, so I went from law school into getting a PhD in human-centered computing, my focus is online communities, and what I was very interested in was how do these people who are not lawyers and really shouldn't know any more about copyright law than the average person, how is everyone making judgments about what they can and can't do when it comes to doing cool, creative stuff online? Because I spent 3 years in law school, and if you ask me if something's fair use, I'm like, well, it could be this thing, or it could be this thing, hashtag I am not your lawyer. And so this was where I started my research a number of years ago. So as a reminder, there are very specific guidelines for what is fair use, but they're a little fuzzy, you weigh them. But there are some things that we know are relevant, some things we know aren't relevant. So the first research study that I did in this area was I did interviews with a lot of people who do various kinds of remixy stuff online. Music remixers, fan fiction writers, graphic artists, this kind of thing. And I asked them about what they could and couldn't do, what they knew about the law, how they made decisions. And one thing that I found was that people were getting things wrong, but they were getting them wrong in the same ways, and they kind of made sense how they were getting them wrong. Like I could see why you would think these things normatively, things like if you're not making money from it, it's always fair use, or there's a blanket exception for educational use, or that it matters whether you attribute to the source, for example. So none of these things are actually true when it comes to fair use, but these were the kinds of judgments that people were making. And they weren't always making bad judgments, but something that was actually more important than what they were getting wrong was that most people, even if they knew a little bit, even if they were getting things right, they weren't confident enough in their judgments to feel good about it. They were still kind of scared. So one of the things that I found was that there were chilling effects. people didn't understand how to make these judgments, and so they were afraid of getting into trouble. This is a quote from one of my interview participants, and she created fan videos, which is a song with clips from TV shows and movies. And she says that she posts them only to her personal journal now, under password protection actually, because of YouTube and sites like that. They have things where they can take down your video once YouTube took down one of my videos. And even if I know I'm not violating the law, that doesn't mean that they know that. I wish I could share my work with more people. This made me very sad. Especially because I knew the kind of work that she was doing. It's the kind of thing that in theory should be fair use. But again, these judgments are difficult to make. And if you go online to any of these creative places, DeviantArt, YouTube, fanfiction communities, music remix sites, you'll find people talking about copyright. And most of the time they're asking questions, they're sharing information. And so the next research study that I did in this area was I did a large-scale content analysis of many, many conversations about copyright that people were having in these spaces. In a nutshell, what I found was that copyright law is causing problems. This is maybe not surprising, but basically every conversation I found about copyright, it was because it was causing some kind of problem for someone. And most of the time these boiled down to being misinformation problems. Either I don't understand this thing, or this thing happened to me and I don't know why, what do I do now, etc. But then the problems became even worse because of misinformation. Because these people weren't asking questions of lawyers or platforms, they were asking questions of each other. More people who in theory don't actually know much more about copyright than they do. So this is just one example of a question. I could show you 100 more like this. Let's say I want to use a photo of a celebrity in a piece of artwork. I realize that pictures of celebrities are copyrighted. I'm not planning to sell my work, just display it online. Is there any way for me to do this without committing copyright infringement? So people are asking questions like this all the time. And it's not like there's even a clear answer to this. Some of the questions I didn't know the answer to, tried to do some research and was like, yeah, there is no answer. So you see lots of this, and then you would see answers. And sometimes they were mostly on point. One of the pieces of data I had was a question about whether fan fiction is legal, and there were probably a dozen responses, all of which were slightly different and all of which were slightly wrong. Had some kind of misinterpretation or even misinformation. And then there were really bad examples like, there's no such thing as fair use. If you use someone else's property without their permission, it's called stealing. Like fair use is this mystical unicorn that people made up to make themselves feel better about stealing stuff. And the response to this was basically, oh, thank you. I have to say, one of the most frustrating things about doing this research study was that I constantly wanted to reply and correct things, but I held back. But one could assume that, okay, they believed this, but they're like, all right, so I guess I'm not gonna do whatever I was gonna do. And this is how you see chilling effects. So this has a real impact on people doing things. I have one example from my life. A few years ago, I got slightly famous for like a week. I wrote a remix of a sexist children's book, and it went pretty viral. And so I got a lot of press. And in response to this, you know, most people were really happy about it. Like, this is a very cool thing that you did. Some of the Gamergate crowd didn't like it. But in general, a very positive response, except for there were a bunch of people who thought that I was committing copyright infringement. There was even someone on Reddit was like, I heard she's getting sued. I was like, oh, I didn't hear that. Do you know something I don't know? So I got a lot of comments like these. I'm not sure that this copyright lawyer understands what's happening here. This is a noble idea, but not how fair use works. And one of the reasons this was really funny was because one of the reasons I did the remix in the first place was I was like, I am going to use this as an example for the rest of my career of like why fair use exists and why it's awesome. But if I weren't someone who knows a lot about copyright and was, an expert on fair use as far as experts on fair use go, I might have seen this and been like, oh, I should take this down. I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want Mattel to sue me. Mattel seems like they have lots of money. And I was just a poor grad student. So there's actually a kind of imbalance of power here, too. And what's really problematic is when the platforms are also giving you misinformation. So YouTube has a copyright school. It's kind of like DUI school. Like if you get a copyright strike on your account, they go make you watch this video before you can get back in your car. And you can look this up, it's the YouTube copyright school. Comments are disabled, which I think is really funny. And when I started watching it, so it's like friendly woodland creatures explaining copyright to you. Like, oh, you shouldn't put episodes of South Park on YouTube. Like, okay, I think they know that. It's like the Game of Thrones problem all over again. And I was like, well, I hope they're going to get to remix and fair use eventually. And so after doing all of this explaining of copyright in like nice, plain language terms, they get to fair use, and they're like, the narrator just starts rattling off the exact language of the fair use statute while it comes in and literally crushes the protagonist. And then they say, this is really hard though, you should probably contact a qualified copyright attorney before you post your non-commercial YouTube video, I guess. And then it gets better. When they explain the counter notification process, so if your video is flagged for copyright infringement, you can fight it. Good, awesome. Except they're like, but you better be really, really sure that you're right about it. Because if you do this and you're wrong, you could get in a lot of trouble. That's how the law works. This is the epigraph on my dissertation. I really hate this video, but it's done really good things for my talks. And it's not like this is misinformation, exactly. It is spun in such a way to benefit YouTube by suggesting that maybe you shouldn't accidentally infringe copyright even. Because as far as YouTube's concerned, like it would be easier for them if there weren't remixes, even though they're great, and they're legal for the most part. Another interesting thing is that a lot of times when this causes problems for people, so like, oh my gosh, my videos keep getting flagged and they shouldn't be, or someone's stealing my work or whatever, it's the platform's fault. This is another quote from my data. YouTube, do something! And they have done something. Well, one thing was the copyright video. I don't think that was particularly effective. But the other way that YouTube deals with copyright is algorithms. So I imagine you've seen this sad face before. So under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, if YouTube receives a, oh my gosh, this is infringing my copyright, they just take the video down. And that's a lot of work. And so now a computer does it. So there's an algorithm, it's a stupid algorithm. By stupid I mean like it's not smart. Like it's basically like, here is a piece of audio or video. Is that same piece of audio or video in this other place? So it basically has no contextual awareness at all. And as a result, lots of stuff that should be getting taken down gets taken down, episodes of Game of Thrones, but also things that shouldn't be taken down. So there are false positives. One of my favorites is Buffy versus Edward. I explained this to my undergraduates recently, and no one in the class knew what Buffy the Vampire Slayer was. I just like wept for the current state of our children. So it's a mashup between Buffy and Twilight. It creates a new narrative in which it's like, what if Edward Cullen met a strong female protagonist? She stakes him at the end with spoilers. And it was intended as like a feminist critique. Jonathan McIntosh, the person who created this video, is actually like a copyright advocate. He spoke in front of the Copyright Office about fair use and used this as an example. And then YouTube's algorithms were like, so it got taken down, got ads attached to it. He fought it, they said nope, and then there was a story in the Washington Post about it, and they're like, woo, here it is again. But what's funny is if Jonathan didn't know a lot about fair use, if he didn't have lots of lawyer friends, then probably it would just be taken down forever. I've talked to many people in the course of my research who are like, yeah, all those, like the graveyard of YouTube videos that were copyright infringement. And it's not just YouTube. This is another one of my favorite examples. The Hugo Awards in 2012, in which, you know, it's Hugo Awards, so media companies send you clips that you can show when you win a thing, and it's very exciting. And the live stream got interrupted, got shut down because Ustream was like, copyrighted content, and it didn't know that they had permission to use it, etc. And you might think, well, this would be an easy fix. Like, if something's fair use, then you should like have a human look at it. That's kind of difficult. And there actually was a court case about this video. If you're ever wondering why this like 30-second really kind of not very good video of a baby dancing has over 1 million hits, it's because of a court case. So this baby is dancing to like 20 seconds of a Prince song playing on a radio, really scratchy. And the algorithms were like, boop, this is copyright infringement. And this became a test case for whether a platform had to consider whether something is fair use before they take it down. And the court said, yes, you do. But this has pretty much zero effect, because yes, I considered it. And again, fair use is so kind of fuzzy and subjective that like you can't prove that they didn't think about it. And some things are really kind of hard to get the context. So if you think of something like using video for critique. So if you see like Anita Sarkeesian's video game tropes series, she uses lots of clips from video games. And it's for the exact reason that fair use exists, is because you have to show something in order to critique it, and it's a safety valve between copyright and free speech. But it's hard, even for a human, to make a judgment about whether this is okay. It's even harder for an algorithm that has to rely on bright line rules. Fair use does not have bright line rules. This is a very important thing. But algorithms must have bright line rules. That's the only way that they can work. So they're being programmed with some rules that can't be quite right. And so an algorithm will never be able to determine fair use with exact accuracy. And then the result, going back to this quote, is that there are false positives. So this has an actual impact on people, this kind of imperfection of algorithms. And if you think about the problem of imperfection of algorithms and the impact that it can have on people and on society, then there's actually something that people care more about than copyright, which is fake news. Earlier when I was trying to think of what to do for this talk, I was like, what do copyright and fake news have in common? And it was like my rant about algorithms. So we see a lot of discussion about this lately, right? So there's no denying that social media has had an impact on increased proliferation of misinformation. And we often see the blame placed on these tech companies, and in particular the algorithms that these tech companies are using. Like, oh my gosh, the fake news is at the top of the algorithm. In fact, after the most recent election, I cannot tell you how many think pieces and media articles we saw that were like, Facebook, you need to fix this. This is your fault, fake news is your fault, you need to fix it. And actually just last weekend, after the shooting in Texas, there were a slew of new news articles about this, in particular bringing up some conspiracy theories that spread very quickly right after this happened. And so some of the examples of things that were being critiqued, we see Google's autocomplete, YouTube, conspiracy theories going to the top of the search results, and then Google search results, which has a popular on Twitter component of it, was showing misinformation in those search results. This has an impact, right? It's not it's at an individual level, it's at a society level. There are lots and lots of things that are contributing to why this is happening. And social media and algorithms are only one of them. But with this being such a serious problem, we want a way to fix it, right? Technology solutionism. Like, how do we fix this technology? It's Facebook's problem. Facebook needs to fix it. And we're very motivated because we see charts like this that show that engagement is higher with fake news and with real news at certain points. There was also a graph going around recently that showed how political polarization has increased a great deal since the advent of social media, etc. So we ask ourselves why this kind of thing is happening. How is there so much misjudgment by both algorithms and by people? A friend of mine at the University of Washington, Kate Starbird, did a very interesting study where she was able to use tweets to map out the ecosystem of misinformation that's being spread through the media. And one of the things that's interesting to think about when you see a chart like this is that, yes, it's true that this chart would not exist if Twitter did not exist. So just the forum, just like how we couldn't have crank calls before there were phones. Should we get rid of phones? Probably not. Should we tell the people who invented phones that they need to fix this problem? I don't know. But the other thing here is that the algorithms aren't making the fake news, right? They're not the ones creating the misinformation. There actually are some ways to have algorithms create fake news, but I would hope that those are the least credible things. But for the most part, there are people who are doing this. And this is something I talk about a lot. I talk about this with a lot of different people, particularly when I hear the sort of Facebook should fix it kind of thing. So is the spread of misinformation via social media a technical problem or a social problem? Like, is this a thing that Facebook needs to fix? Is this a thing that society needs to fix? And the answer, clearly, is that it's both. But one is a more important problem, and the other one is easier to solve. So again, we see this technological solutionism because, the problem of why do people create fake news, why do people believe fake news, and why do people spread fake news? This is the real problem. It's also super, super hard. How do we fix that? It's really difficult to say, and so it's much easier to be like, well, if there was no Facebook, then there would be no fake news spreading on Facebook, so therefore it is Facebook's problem to fix it. They need to, I don't know, algorithms. And it's actually true that there could be a technological band-aid for this problem, right? So even if people are going to spread it, et cetera, if you could suppress it, if you could flag it, et cetera, that might be a band-aid for the problem, but it's not going to fix the underlying problem. So for example, I showed you this earlier, there were news articles about this, like, oh my gosh, Google needs to fix their search results so that, you know, fake tweets aren't showing up at the top of your page. And they can do that, probably. If you can make the algorithms a little better. Though again, there's going to be false positives, just like there are with the copyright stuff. There's going to be real things that are suppressed as collateral damage. But to me, the bigger problem is, so there's people who are believing stuff from Twitter instead of the real news that's above it. Like to me, this isn't necessarily Google's problem. Like they're flagging this very clearly as this is from Twitter, but why are we believing that something from Twitter is the thing I should click on instead of an actual news article? Which then brings me to the other problem, which is that even if we made algorithms perfect, like can absolutely, yes, fake news, shove it to the bottom of the search results. We know that people seek out information that verifies their already held beliefs. Like, that's just how humans work a lot of the time. So even if you shove it to the bottom of the search results, if there's someone who thinks that CNN is always, if they think that CNN is incredible, if they think that this thing down here, oh, this has to be right because this fits my worldview already, they're going to click down here. It doesn't matter what order the search engine gives you your results in. So an algorithm will never be able to perfectly evaluate fair use. And even a perfect algorithm won't be able to stop fake news. These are both things that are squishy human judgments, and sometimes even squishier algorithmic judgments. And so misinformation and misjudgment is both a human and a technical problem. And therefore it needs human and technical solutions. And they're very hard solutions. Here's one example of a kind of thing that's been happening. So this is a pop-up on Facebook that says, hey, before you share this story, you might want to know that independent fact checkers have disputed its accuracy. This is something that could be working in different ways, or that you could make work in different ways. One is you have people who are like, all right, here's a story, here's a Facebook story, fake, not fake, fake, not fake. It could be something where people are flagging it when they see it. Though that has problems because we also know that some people are jerks, and it's pretty easy to like organize in order to mess things up, for example. Or it's algorithms. Maybe the algorithm is an independent fact checker, because that's how we can scale things up. Because I would say, hey, YouTube, every time someone flags a video, every time your algorithm flags a video as copyright infringement, there should be a person who makes that evaluation. But A, that's a lot of resources, a lot of people, a lot of money. And B, as we know, it's difficult even for people to make judgments about fair use. So are there certain liability issues if they get it wrong, et cetera? So I like to try to have a hopeful note when I'm thinking about these things. So if we're thinking about like, what can we do? And then I have question marks behind everything. So we've talked about like better algorithms. So but again, if we make the algorithms perfect, we still sometimes have problems. And some things like fair use, I just can't see us ever having an algorithm that can be good enough. Because I like, do we need smarter people, by which I mean people who can make better judgments? And then how do we do that? It's also a tricky sort of situation. Everyone can have a librarian in their pocket. So like when I was a kid, I got my book recommendations. If I could have that same librarian, like basically an information specialist, hey, is this fair use? Also, hey, is this real? Is this credible? Is it not credible? But this is a problem with scale. obviously. And similar sorts of things with like having humans in the loop at all. So there definitely are some cases where there are people who are doing things like moderating content, checking algorithms, and then of course there are the humans who create the data sets that make the algorithms. Because if we're, machine learning means we have to teach a machine, you have to teach it with something. So first, humans have to be in there somewhere. But again, this can be difficult to scale, and then at the point where the humans come out of the loop, then we start having flaws in algorithms again. So there are two things that I've been thinking about most with respect to this. One is algorithmic transparency. So the filter bubble is a problem in part because people don't know that the filter bubble exists. So there's been a lot of research that shows that people don't know that algorithms are a thing. Like, they don't know that Facebook is like changing what order their news feed comes in. They don't know that their search results on Google are personalized. Like, this is what everyone sees, and so you think it is truth. But if you're looking at fake news all day, and the fake news starts to impact your search results, and this is like feedback. But if the algorithm told people like, hey, I'm personalized, just so you know, this is not what everyone in the world is saying, this is not ground truth. Or if it's showing you how it's working. And the other problem with something like teaching people about credibility is if the technological solution is to just delete all the fake news, then you're not going to learn what's fake news, right? So you can't build norms if you can't see the things that are happening, if you can't see people breaking norms. So in theory, it's actually better to flag something as fake news and say, hey, this is fake news, here's why, learn something, as opposed to just deleting things. And then the very obvious last one, which is various kinds of education. This is very difficult, though. And there's a lot of initiatives lately towards information literacy, for example. I also, for a while, wanted to do something around fair use education online, but again, even when you know a lot, it still is squishy enough that it can make people not confident, etc. Or again, like the dancing baby video on YouTube, like they know that's fair use. Like it's the cleanest, easiest example ever. But that's not because of this imbalance of power. It's not necessarily going to mean that your content is safe. And then in terms of information literacy, you have to convince people that they need to know this, that they should care, which perhaps is another kind of education. And so I guess my takeaway from all of this is that we need both the technical and the human, right? So we need information specialists, we need technologists, we need social scientists, and we need them to all care and know about each other. I am in an information science department, and one of my majors the other day, when I was bringing up an ethical issue, I said, and so if you were working at a company, what would you have done if you were asked to do this? And he said, well, this is why I'm an information scientist and not a computer scientist, because I actually care about social implications. Which is perhaps an unfair stereotype for computer scientists. However, I will say, having been on both sides of the board, there is certainly a difference in those kinds of education that people are getting. And so we need technologists to understand the human side as well. And I will leave you with my final thought about things that we can do with our superpowers. Barbara Gordon, the world's best librarian / information scientist / hacker. If she can do it, then I'm pretty sure that there's some superheroes out there when it comes to misinformation and misjudgment. So I will leave you with that. And I think I have time for questions. There are questions.
Thank you very much. This was really informative. Something that always breaks my mind whenever Google comes around and things is the element of marketing. and how that figures into the algorithm. So and also the frequency that you just mentioned, but what role does marketing play? Because I really think a lot of these sites and things are trying to sell products, they're trying to sell images, and they've been successful. But Google doesn't seem to address that, other than maybe as an ad on occasion. So any comments on that?
Yeah, you bring up a very good point. And so the thing that I didn't bring up is that something else that should change are basically marketing models. And I think one of the reasons that people feel so negatively towards Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, when it comes to these things, is because they know they're making money off of it. And this is partly because I have many friends and colleagues who work at these companies and who I've talked to about these kinds of things. I don't think that Facebook, et cetera, are maliciously like, yay, more fake news, like Scrooge McDuck, like all the fake news. I really think it is a hard problem. However, changing marketing models could convince people to work a little harder on it. I mean, the other thing is, and why people create fake news, it's because it makes them money, right? I've seen some things, for example, there's a Twitter account, I can't remember what it's called, but it's entirely devoted to getting lots and lots of people to tweet at companies that have like Breitbart ads and this kind of thing on their sites. And sometimes these kinds of grassroots things are the only, I mean, it's very difficult to say how to fix that. I mean, sometimes places like Google and Facebook will stop showing ads of certain kinds of things, but then you're making judgments about what's okay, and that also causes a big problem. I mean, the other thing I didn't mention is that all of this then butts up against free speech. And in theory, fake news, the government, for example, cannot shut down fake news without better reasons. But Twitter and Google and Facebook could, in theory, because they're private companies. So Facebook could say, no cats. We hate cats, no more cats, I'm deleting all of your cats. They can do the same thing with fake news. But you can see why companies might be wary to make that kind of value judgment. We're running out of the mic.
I have long wondered why companies often try to shut down fan-created videos and things like that, because I would think it would help promote the product. It might benefit the media companies in some way. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have lots of feelings about this. I'm on the legal committee for the Organization for Transformative Works, which is intended entirely to protect the legal, et cetera, interests of fan creators. Honestly, the fact that, for example, there has never been a court case about fan fiction suggests that, for the most part, people are letting well enough alone. I mean, considering the amount of fan-created work that is out there and the very small kind of number of serious cases that we've had about it, I think it's working okay. There's actually some fear that if there ever is a real court case, then if you lose, then it just destroys everything, so maybe the status quo is kind of okay. On the other hand, the examples that I was giving of videos being taken down from YouTube, because of this imbalance of power, we might not even know that this is happening all the time, because it's way easier to send a takedown notice than it is to fight it. But so I completely agree with you, and I think that most media companies realize that it would not be in their best interest to go after fans for obvious PR reasons. And when we do see things happen, then it does tend to get bad PR, and this is good because it sets an example for everyone else not to go after the fans.
Just as another possible response on that, I think it's important to separate out fans using media in a positive light and fans critiquing media. And I think like the Buffy versus Edward thing, that's probably something that the creators of Twilight would not want to allow to stay up because it very much critiques it instead of helps promote it. So just as a possible like why they actually would pursue taking things down. I had sort of a tangential question though. Are you, on the copyright side of things, what do you think about like going for copyright reform to just make it cleaner and easier to understand and more obvious for people and all of that?
I do think there are some kinds of copyright reform that could help. For fair use in particular, sometimes it comes up like, should we make fair use have bright line rules so that people can make judgments about it easier? I am not necessarily in favor of that. And the reason is because the fact that it's a little bit squishy, on the one hand, causes all the problems that I talked about. On the other hand, it means that it's flexible. And the law changes far slower than technology changes. And if you make bright line rules, I worry that like the next technology that comes up would just break everything. This is why, for example, the DMCA, the laws around anti-circumvention laws, which basically says it is illegal to break copyright protection on something. Every 3 years, the Copyright Office has a rulemaking proceeding where people propose exemptions to this law. And that allowed us, for example, to have an exemption for ripping DVDs to make non-commercial remix videos. But when the law was created in the late 90s, like YouTube was not a thing, and normal people, like everyday people, didn't have like software to make remix videos. So if those changes didn't exist, then we'd be like butting our heads up against that law all the time. So I'm of two minds about fair use. I wish that it was easier to understand, but I think it might cause more problems if we made it more rigid.
Well, and I think another reason that fair use is so squishy is that it never even really becomes a problem until somebody takes you to court over it. And so when I have worked with faculty and they're like, well, can I do this? I can't tell you that. Is it fair use? Well, it's a scale and you have to weigh it. And it only really becomes a hard rule unless somebody takes you to court. And I think that's also really squishy, why people don't fight takedowns and things like that, because you can't afford to fight the man.
Yep. That's actually the exact advice I give people. So people ask me all the time, like, is this fair use? And I'm like, well, I can make you a super good argument for why it's fair use, but that's not going to help you if it gets taken down. So then, like, hashtag I am not your lawyer, but you could do the thing, and then if something happens, that's when you decide whether you have to fight it.
Kind of a simple question. What are your thoughts on tools like Snopes.com? And are there other tools that I'm not aware of?
That's a good question. So I use Snopes. As far as I can tell, Snopes seems to be pretty credible. Though usually when I use Snopes, I actually look to see what they're sourcing. And it depends on why I'm using Snopes. Like, if I am using Snopes because someone just posted something on Facebook that is completely ridiculous and I am fact-checking them, then I want to not just rely on Snopes because I want to make sure that I'm 100% positive. And then, I mean, the problem with tools like this, I've also had people say like, oh, well, everyone knows that Snopes is like, you know, owned by a bunch of liberals that are just trying to take everything down, etc. And I mean, that's why like fact-checking has also become very difficult because it's not just an issue of like fake and not fake, but it's people not agreeing on what's credible at all anymore. And so, and this gets even scarier. So actually the example that I was using with my students about ethical technology in class the other day was there's technology that can create a video that makes President Obama say whatever you want him to say. If you guys haven't seen this, it's basically technology where you can manipulate a face to match audio. And so they demonstrated this technology at a conference, and they were like, this is great technology that has amazing applications like summarizing video. And then an episode of Radiolab talked to the researcher and said, so you know this is going to be used for fake news, right? And she was like, what? And seemed as if that hadn't occurred to her before, and said, you know, well, I'm a technologist. Like, society figures out the implications of these things. I just invent things. And that's a whole other issue. But I hope that I got that through the heads of my undergrads who are going to go through and be technologists. That you should be thinking in some ways about how something will be used.
What other question?
I have not read it. I think it's called Weapons of Math Destruction.
Oh, yeah, Kathy, I know. Yeah,
about the algorithms. Are you going to work towards the algorithm issue a little bit more?
Algorithms is not my particular area of research. I do research on ethics, though, which kind of goes, so I'm interested in things like algorithmic bias, and you know, the data that we are training these algorithms with, where does it come from, what does it look like? For example, I saw a recent example where there's a software that Microsoft has created that automatically captions images for the blind, which is really cool. And it obviously doesn't work all the time, but it has one particular flaw that comes up over and over, which is that it often thinks things are sports. So for example, there's an image of Hillary Clinton at a rally, and the caption says, "This is a man on a skateboard at night." And the reason for this is because training data sets often have certain kinds of bias, and this one in particular had many, many more men in it than women, and therefore lots of activities that men do, and therefore lots of sports. And you see the same kind of thing, for example, like computer vision aids that don't recognize dark skin, and this kind of thing. This is all a problem with the training data, and you would think that by now we know this is a problem. And so that's the kind of thing that I've been thinking about more in terms of algorithms, that and the kind of algorithmic transparency that I talked about.
So thank you for Casey's presentation, and also you guys